Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Tony Lauro. He's Director of Security, Technology, and Strategy at Akamai. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks for having me, John. How are you?
Doing great. Excited for this discussion. It's the topic that no CIO can avoid, but even though they might want to, because it's so challenging. But before we dive into the topic, tell us a little bit about yourself and Akamai.
Sure. I've been at Akamai for 11 years. My role is working within the CISO leadership at large organizations worldwide to make sure that as we develop technology, we're going in the direction that they need us to ultimately, making sure that we're taking care of those needs and future perceived needs. Akamai itself has been around for 25 years, started as a content delivery network with globally distributed servers. But now it's the world's largest cloud security platform. So we do everything from DDoS protection, web application and API security, enterprise security, segmentation, kind of the works. And, with all of that, we're kind of seeing kind of a global footprint of a third of the world's web traffic every day flows through our platform. So
Wow.
our goal is to apply that kind of collective intelligence across all of the decisions that we allow our customers to make using that data. So that instead of just saying, hey, I trust Akamai, block it, you can have that intelligence inside of that business decision that you make a yes or no call. So to me, that's a pretty great value.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting you have such data to be able to do those insights. And, in a recent Akamai report, you found that the average rate of increase in ransomware attacks for healthcare is the highest across all industries, which I think everyone in healthcare feels that. But
Yeah.
why do you think that is the case that healthcare is being attacked so much?
There's a few different factors. Obviously, one, what's at stake for the attacker? The positive outcome for an attacker is maybe I hit a healthcare company with ransomware. There's kind of a Goldilocks zone too to how much money you probably have in terms of revenue and spendable cash versus how big your security organization is, how well built out it is, and how mature. So the attackers target healthcare orgs because they know they don't want to be in the news. They'll probably pay out a ransom, and their security teams probably aren't, or their security programs are not fully looking at all the different problem sets that they could be, as opposed to industries that seem very well attacked, which would be financial services, e-commerce, etc. So they're kind of going with a bit of an ebb and flow in terms of we know that, hey, we've seen it work in the past with attacks, from scattered Spider and Alpha V. We know that these groups are making money, so let's copycat that same activity and target healthcare providers.
That's interesting. I've never heard that comparison of ability to pay versus investment in trying not to be breached. Because you're right that there is an imbalance there in healthcare. We haven't invested the same way as other organizations, and we have a lot of points of vulnerability. Every healthcare organization has 1,000+ applications, so I think that's the other challenge. Are there some
Absolutely.
things that healthcare organizations are maybe doing wrong when it comes to security? Any suggestions for them? And I don't say this as a shame, right? We're not shaming people, but are there
Yeah.
some things you see that you're like, man, this is dangerous, and this is why you're at risk?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily healthcare orgs are doing anything wrong. I
Mm.
think one thing to really keep in mind is that obviously there's a lot at stake. The first and foremost priority uh, in a healthcare scenario is the patient outcome, right? But there's other factors that come into play, and that's patient experience, that's modernization of applications and IoT services that work within those environments. And as the complexity grows within these environments, so does the risk that something could go wrong. So does the attack surface. And if you look, I mean, even modern healthcare applications that are using APIs, e-commerce and banking have been using APIs. There's a huge rise in API usage. This is application programming interfaces, which basically every time you pick up your phone, it's sending an API call to retrieve data. That is also driving the attack surface up, but because of the rate of adoption, financial services and e-commerce who have been using it for longer, they've already have that scar tissue built up, those lessons learned. So now that healthcare is modernizing and we're seeing more innovative applications and patient services, et cetera, and payment services for that matter, now healthcare is going to have to go through that pain. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So nothing really wrong. It's just that as the application environment grows and the attackers focus on access to applications or systems that run them, that's why we're seeing more attacks. It's just it's a kind of a commoditized situation here. So it's not necessarily because healthcare is doing something bad, but the attackers know that they may not be doing everything right, and that's why they're going to attack.
It's interesting. You mentioned a couple things that are fascinating. One is healthcare was later to go electronic than maybe some of the e-commerce or banking organizations. So, like you said, we haven't created the scar tissue that you need to motivate your efforts in security, which is interesting. Yeah. But you also said something else interesting. You said the number one goal is the patient outcome for healthcare, which is true, although the pessimists may say I'm financial. But anyway, I'll set aside the pessimist for now. But I don't think it's often that we look at and say, well, our security, posture and decreasing the security risk is important to the patient outcome. Go talk to the hospital that's been down for 2 months because of a ransomware incident, and patients are getting impacted. So it's interesting that when you talk to healthcare organizations, do they come at it from a patient outcome perspective? Because they should.
Yeah, they should. I think the underlying system and structure is obviously patient outcome is like the one variable that never changes. But you're right. Most organizations that deal with patients, they've got to stay financially sound, right? So the business aspect of it, how they fund their projects, how they pay their employees, how they keep the lights on, so to speak, is a huge, if not number one priority. So yes, so the pessimists are kind of right in a sense, because if the business can't function, then you can't meet your goal of taking care of the patients as a number one focus, right? Yeah. So it is a tricky cat and mouse, but I feel with most organizations I've spoken to, if you look at maybe a banking app, for instance, if I have a check that I need to take a picture of, because I'm not going to go deposit a check. Someone gave me a check, my grandma. I don't use checks anymore, full disclosure. But if my banking app can't let me take a photo of that check and upload it, I'm going to be like, this banking app stinks. I'm going to move to something else. So we're seeing a little bit of that same type of activity, in the healthcare space, where we need access to modern applications. They need to function on behalf of the users, and they need to operate with minimal friction. So the creation of those environments that create minimal friction for having services rendered, paying, the finances of everything, the insurance claims, everything back, all that modernization is where the attackers are focusing, because, as you develop new technology, it's a great time for attackers to target it,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, talking about sadly new technology for healthcare, although we've been discussing it for a decade, maybe 2 decades, is cloud, right? Do you think cloud has made us more or less secure? And talk to me about how healthcare should be approaching cloud security.
That's a great question, right? Because for many organizations, as they kind of did a lift and shift to the cloud, they literally did that. They rebuilt their environments the way they had them on premises into a cloud environment. Only now, those servers are further away. Those systems are, for the most part, harder to kind of interact with. the way you were used to doing it. But the biggest piece of the puzzle is that many organizations that went through this shift, they kind of assumed that the cloud was more secure by default. And it's simply not. It's a different architectural platform. They have different services you can add on and play with. But you still have to specifically go out and procure those, have those added to your contract, enable them, deploy them, etc. So there was a little bit of confusion in the early days of cloud adoption in healthcare, like with open S3 buckets and kind of default settings kind of issues, which generally speaking, every vertical has had those same problems. But now that we're kind of in a more modern age and healthcare is kind of catching up to that cloud adoption, they're going through the pains and growing pains of deploying new technology. So when you look at cloud environments, most healthcare orgs do not want just a single cloud environment. So you've got a couple technical issues, right? Your team needs to now be trained on how to manage multiple cloud environments. Any security services or tools that are specific to each of those cloud environments, because a lot of those cloud vendors sell their own tools, they now have to be trained on how to manage those and the functionality of all that. So operationally, you're now trying to say, I've got 2 or 3 different cloud environments. I'm trying to bring those logs into and amalgamate, validate what's happening across these different environments. And that's a tough process from a technical standpoint. So when we look at cloud security, we think of primarily what can you do out above the cloud environment layer, restrict access to the cloud environment, and create a set of tools that function seamlessly across the different disparate cloud environments, no matter what their backend configurations look like. So that now you can have a consistent security posture, auditing becomes better, regulatory reporting becomes easier, because you say, these are the rule sets and the functionality I have protecting these environments. And I can give you a piece of paper that says, this is what's happening, and it looks the same for all environments. And the only difference is you further lock down the cloud environments to only receive traffic from this kind of trusted layer. And to us, and even kind of standing back from what Akamai does, I see this model being pushed by a lot of different vendors, because they realize you have to have this other layer in front to apply security. And now, if we talk about ransomware and what happens inside of those environments, there's a similar story as far as orchestration, but it does require distributed systems, because attackers can DOS these environments. They can even DDoS cloud environments that are massive. Think of your biggest cloud provider name. They can get attacked and take down data center regions, and it happens, right? So we're thinking about this at a global scale for all types of organizations, but focusing on healthcare, we've got a specific set of things that we do based on the threats that they face most often.
Yeah. And you're right. I think the attackers love inconsistency, right? Because that inconsistency is where they can abuse an organization that doesn't realize they have this loophole, because they've been inconsistent in how they rolled out cloud or how they applied security to the different cloud environments. That's interesting. Well, I don't think we'd be an IT podcast if we didn't mention AI. So let's talk a little bit of AI. But I think what's interesting in this case is that the role of AI is happening with attacks and the attackers, but also in cybersecurity. So I'd love to hear what you see happening with AI, both on the attack side and the attackers using AI to breach us. I think phishing is probably the most common to me, but anyway, I'd love to hear if you have other ones. And then also you being used in the cybersecurity efforts to, avoid those threats or to mitigate the risks, or, what do you see happening with AI with cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. Phishing, the first one that pops up, obviously, is kind of a no-brainer. Instead of getting the Nigerian prince scam that's poorly written, it doesn't even It doesn't even seem like they're talking to the person that they meant to email. Sounds like they're talking in super generalities. That can all be very narrowly focused on the type of employee you are, your relationship to other employees in the organization, which they can do recon through LinkedIn and find out this information. So that now is a whole different ball game. So any email you get, if it's unsolicited and you you didn't expect to receive this, or even if you did expect to receive it, you should be wary of responding to that or clicking and downloading PDF documents. I get some all the time that says your subscription of Norton Antivirus has just been renewed for $599. And then it has a PDF document, invoice attached. And your first instinct would be like, oh man, somebody just charged me $599. Like that's the first thing, right? Like what's going to make you click on it? But then when you open up the PDF, it probably runs scripts in the backgrounds and infects your computer. But more so than that, the attack tools the attackers are creating, the intelligence gathering behind those tools and how they function, as far as finding who's going to be the best target, all of that is starting to be more and more driven by AI. And to me, as an attacker, if my goal is to kind of spray and pray, and now I can do it at a much more massive automated level using AI to kind of feed me more data, I mean that's a dream job for a bad guy. Less work, more outcome, more positive outcomes, right?
Yeah.
From the defensive standpoint, the General Services Administration just announced a big campaign and a framework on how they plan to use AI in things like FedRAMP, in other parts of what they do, to bolster how those systems are functioning. There's even frameworks being created now that require organizations that are developing software to talk about how they're using AI, share best practices, and give kind of a general kind of a little trade winds going between different software development organizations that can say, I attest to the fact that I'm using best practices to create this. I'm resilient against these types of things. And AI is on that list. Looking at where you're pulling data from, obviously is also an interesting point. So there's so much going on, but the government, on the government side and the public sector, they're definitely looking at this as a huge risk. And from a tool creation perspective, they're hoping to make gains as well.
Interesting. Yeah, to me, it feels like the only way to defend yourself against the volume of attacks is through AI, right? Like, I mean, whether it's log files or other, other things that you're scanning, we see the same thing happen with EHR vendors and even HIPAA violations. The only way to scale it is through AI. No one's going to go search and see if you looked up Britney Spears, right? Like,
Yeah.
That's a HIPAA violation, not which is a type of security violation. But anyway, let alone you looking up your neighbor because you wanted to see why they were in the hospital, right? Being able to detect those patterns, the only way to do that is with AI. And I think the same is true with all the cybersecurity attacks that are happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's just such a large volume of attacks these days. As the internet, this sounds silly saying, but as the internet has grown in popularity from the early 90s, when most normal people got on the internet, I say normal, say your average consumer, mid 90s got on the internet. There is such a massive volume of attacks every single day that, yeah, you need some sort of machine learning and AI to look through this, to validate what looks normal, what is a deviation of normal behavior beyond a certain measure, and then apply best practices. You may not be able to say, hey, I'm going to block this fully, but you may say, I know the top 10 types of bad things I don't want to see. Let me apply a rule to that traffic just to make sure they're not doing anything that is bypassing the typical pattern recognition or rule sets. But you have to be able to identify what is being attacked. And most organizations, I mentioned APIs earlier, even identifying what APIs are in the environment. You mentioned earlier something that kind of made me giggle. The idea that we are always trying to protect the crown jewels, but it's always like the dev site that we created, for a test process, 3 quarters ago, that we were supposed to decommission, but it's still out there and it still points to production. And oh yeah, it never got patched for the last 3 quarters. That's where the attackers find their way in, right? So there's there's no easy day for the defenders out there.
Yeah, that's true. And all the legacy vendors, the archive vendors are really happy with what you just said because that's kind of their whole business model. Stop upgrading and paying fees for, or not upgrading, even worse, these old
Yeah.
ones. In fact, that's what's driving many of these legacy archives is archive your old applications because of security risk as much as business continuity or patient centricity. So it's interesting. What would you say are some key things that healthcare organizations should be doing to prepare their companies going forward to deal with this evolving security landscape?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is to make sure that you are keeping up with the times, so to speak. And simply put, I mentioned how healthcare is kind of lagging behind in adoption of new technology. Um, that's not to say that go out and start using everything brand new. But as you implement new technology, look at lessons learned from other industries that have already had those pains and growing pains that have given lessons. So as you're developing new things, you're not making the same mistakes over and over again. And then to the point about legacy, software and environments, we know that there's always going to be legacy environments unless you're a brand new corporation and you're starting from scratch. Maybe you can have the luxury of not having to support these old systems or old processes. But look back and review the old systems and processes that you have in place that kind of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That does not work in the cybersecurity realm. If it's not broke, it probably is already broken and you just don't know it. So don't quote me directly on that, but you see what I'm saying though? The idea that we have things in place that they just run, they just function. Eventually, those older systems that seem to be rock solid, we're seeing that those are being exploited. So it's not always the new shiny, hotness. It's the systems we've had in place for many years that a new vulnerability, 0 day is discovered, or the attackers figure out a new way to exploit them via new means. We talked about some of the playbooks of the ransomware groups. They target IT and help desk employees. They call from a local area code, and they're saying, "Hey, can you add another device to my two-factor auth service?" So they have MFA. It's like, oh, great, but they're tricking the help desk to add another device to the MFA two-factor authentication process, which arguably is kind of broken to many degrees. If you've seen the news about people bypassing MFA and what that looks like, either through technical means or social engineering and technical means, nothing's safe in that aspect. If you look at the underlying technology, right? So it's there's a lot to be done in terms of how we allow remote employees to access these environments that we're supporting, let alone dealing with the actual cyber risks of attackers trying to come into these environments.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one of my favorite phrases, which I think corresponds to what you were saying, was I like to say ignorance is bliss until it's not. Like
Yes.
it feels like bliss when you're ignorant to that legacy applications lack of security until it breaches, and then guess what? It's not blissful anymore.
Yeah.
It's a challenge for sure. How do you think the future, what do you think the future of healthcare IT security looks like? You know, like if I were to look at the history, we started out with firewalls and appliances and, you know, kind of hardware fixes, and we've done really well with that, right? I mean, they don't attack that anymore because it's done so well.
Yeah.
You know, largely, some exceptions, right? And now we're, you know, then we kind of evolved to kind of, all right, now how do we analyze emails and make sure, you know, and help people, individuals, and understand some of those. How do you see, you know, and AI is evolving all of this, right? How do you see the kind of future of healthcare IT security evolving?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see is going to be kind of mirrored across many different verticals. Um, but you're absolutely right. Ask yourself the question, you look at these massive data breaches, you look at ransomware attacks, you look at the nature of this. Um, is that to say that these organizations didn't have good firewalls, antivirus, executable prevention, URL filtering, web application firewalls,
Yep.
database firewall? They could have everything. But once the attackers get into the network, the I like to say the status quo of how that network functions is it allows devices to talk to each other because that's how business actually gets done, right? That's how the business functions. So when an attacker gets into an environment, they start to look at, oh, what can I talk to? And you'll see this all the times if you look at data breach reports. The attackers get in, they open up native tools and they start listening on the network, seeing who's talking to who. So if I can't talk to your system, but you're talking to the database server that my system can talk to as well. Now I'll go to that database server and then go back to your system. So the idea of VLANs and protecting, with kind of traditional segmentation becomes a moot point because the attackers know how to traverse environments. So I think the future is really looking at one, having all these layered defenses on the front end of who's coming into the environment, uh, users through applications, employees through remote access. This is why ZTNA has become so popular because they're trying to remove all the unneeded network access that remote employees get when all they need to do is access an application. You'll see a lot of that evolving and already has. But then segmentation, when you look at the idea of going down to a software-defined model where you're kind of ring fencing each individual system and creating a network policy map that watches how those devices talk to each other, I think that's going to be a big piece of the puzzle. Because now you can say, oh, my computer, I usually come on at this time. This is how I operate. These are the different things I talk to. The moment something starts to occur that looks like Tony would never do this, or even this system that has no person sitting at it would never normally have this kind of chatter, you can reduce the blast radius of probably that ransomware or malware or whatever's executing to just that one system. And if you have a device that can't take an agent or any kind of policy, you can tell the other devices, oh, I saw something bad happen here. Don't receive traffic from this system. So you can look at it from multiple directions. But I think focusing on how to contain the eventual bad thing that's going to happen, because we know that all these organizations that have great security still have the same problems. I think that's the future of healthcare security, especially with all the IoT devices, the headless devices that provide some very specific, unique functionality in that environment. It's not easy to manage those. So you have to have some idea of what normal communication looks like, create a policy around that, discover new things that are happening, and then apply, controls to that. I think that's the only way to change the game at this point, other than turn off all the systems and go back to the old school,
Paper
paper and
charts.
pencil.
Well, they're not secure either. You can't track that either. But
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it is fascinating, right? Imagine a CEO who got up and said, "Hey, we're going to use less technology. we're going to implement fewer devices, and we're you know, and we're going to do
Yeah, it
less
seems like a
remote. We're
stop
not
of
going to we're
progress.
going to
Yeah,
yeah, we're going to engage patients less, like all of those would help reduce the risk surface, the security risk surface. But of course, everyone's saying exactly the opposite. We need to engage
exactly.
patients more. We need to send more devices out. We need to have more devices tracking and observing and and so that is the right there. That is the challenge of security.
Yeah,
And then healthcare 24/7. Like you may log in at 4 a.m. in healthcare and use a computer, whereas in most businesses probably not. So like another
correct.
reason it's challenge in healthcare. Awesome. Well, Tony, this was a fun discussion. Gave me some interesting perspectives and insights. I think our audience will really appreciate what you shared. And thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcast applications. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, John. Have a great time.